My name is Greg Olahan. I'm with ICLR, and it's my pleasure to act as moderator for our speakers today. We have a great lineup of speakers, and I'm looking forward to hearing what each one has to say. As Dan mentioned, we'll allow 5 minutes for questions at the end of each talk, and then if we can't get to your questions during that time, we'll have some more time this afternoon when our panel is assembled up here, and we'll have some good discussion at that point. So at this point, I'd like to invite our first speaker up this morning, Professor Ted Kesik. Dr. Kesik, come on up, please. Dr. Kesik is a professor of building science in the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. He has conducted research on basement flooding since 1986 and continues to practice as a consulting engineer to leading architectural offices, forward-thinking enterprises, and progressive government agencies. Currently, Dr. Kesik is exploring opportunities for enhancing resilience and sustainability within the context of Ontario's official growth plan. Welcome here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's really encouraging to see an event like this. I thought earlier on in my career when I was doing this sort of stuff that nobody really cared about basement flooding. And that was really because of the history of basements. You know, they were these horrible places that people just didn't care about. I remember the basement in my home when I was growing up as a kid, and it was just really a place for the furnace and the water heater. And at one time it even stored coal, and that was it. And people expected them to leak. And I remember when I first started studying building science, we had this wonderful fellow, Gus Handegord from the National Research Council, came to the U of T to give a special course, and he tried to explain to us the sort of logic behind basements. He said, well, he says, I'll put it to you this way. He said, in Saskatchewan, farmers dig holes in fields and hope that they fill up with water for their cattle. He says, in Ontario, builders dig holes in fields, put basements into them, and hope to God that they will never fill up with water. He said, do you understand how the physics has not changed under either of those two circumstances? And we all said, yeah, we get it. So somebody might say, well, maybe we just shouldn't have basements and be done with it, but I don't think it's that simple. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here and to share some perspectives. I've been at this a long time, and I think you're all in for a great day. Well, where do we begin? Here's a good example of the sort of stuff that happens. And, you know, there's somebody looking at all of their soaking wet pictures after their basement flooding event, and, you know, it's not something that any of us really want to go through. We don't want to have these cherished and irreplaceable, in some cases, objects damaged, but it happens, and it happens everywhere and almost all the time nowadays. So one of the things that we'd like to then maybe look at then is the big picture, and that's what I'm trying to start out with today, to sort of frame the context about which you can start to think of this issue. We know that all of this basement flooding is certainly rising, and it's for a whole bunch of reasons in terms of, let's say, the number of incidents, the severity of the incidents, the cost. It's up at almost $16,000 for the average claim. And that trend is a real trend. It's unlikely in the short term that it's going to change unless everybody in this room and other people that have similar interests are willing to work together to deal with that. And so it's not insurmountable, but that's the trend line today. Unfortunately, the same trend applies to persons without any form of insurance coverage, and those people are never counted in the statistics. So this is something that is difficult to imagine. We have excellent statistics for the automobile industry in terms of accidents, claims. We know everything that we need to know about these $20,000 to $30,000 vehicles that last about, on average, 10 years. We don't know very much about $500,000 houses that are going to be with us for the next 100 to 150 years. And that's just where we're at. The real costs, and I know they're difficult to estimate, but they include things like not just the insurance claims, And not just the homeowner and tenant uninsured losses, because there are many losses. And I remember I was at my cabin up north where I enjoy greater energy security because of PV panels than the rest of Toronto enjoyed during the July 8th storm. And so I discovered eventually that there was a storm in Toronto, and when I got back to Toronto a couple of days later, my mailbox, as you can imagine, somebody like me who's involved in the field of basement flooding, was filled, and all of them were friends and family and associates that said, what am I going to do? And that's like, it's horrible. And so, you know, how do you put a dollar value on that? And it's one of those things. We just really don't ever go and look at that, and there's lots of time, there's running around, there's having to deal with contractors. You know, I told most people, I said, the odds are so slim that you're gonna get a storm like this tomorrow or in the next week. I said, why don't you just cool it? Because right now, I said, everybody's making a fortune off of people because they've all freaked out and they come and fix, and you know, there's people who are ripping stuff out and just doing things. It was just a heyday. I mean, people made money hand over fist, right? I mean, in one case, one friend of mine said that the contractor that came over to replace the drywall didn't know the drywall had to be screwed to studs. So they were out there and they were cleaning up and they were really making good money, and that's the way it goes. And so when we look at all of that and rental incomes and so many things, we really don't ever really know what it is, but I'm sure it's an amazing number, and it's much, much higher than the insurance claims. And if you were to even pay people minimum wage for the time they spent having to negotiate all of these things and all of these inconveniences. So, to make it worse, we have the risks and history of basement flooding are not shared. They exist, but they exist in a whole bunch of different databases. Each insurance company has a database of the claims that it's made and paid out. Then there's all the unknown ones. Municipalities know. They get telephone calls, my basement's flooded. But do they actually have a procedure by which to record and put down that the basement on this date at this address flooded? There's no risk or history of basement flooding registry anywhere that we can go to find that out. And for some reason, most of this stuff that you're going to see today, we've known about for a long, long time. Now, some of it obviously was quite advanced thinking. The new approaches to stormwater management, I can remember as an undergraduate student, and there might be somebody in the room that's as old as I am or older, and they may have remembered people. I had a professor by the name of Paul Wiesner who was an urban hydrologist and was absolutely brilliant when it came to modeling. And of course, all of these models were done, and they knew how to really mitigate to the highest degree possible. But of course, the planning people, you know, they didn't always avail themselves of the best and latest technology when it came to designing these systems. And so they kept doing what they kept doing in subdivision after subdivision. But you know, did we know how to do it? Yes, we could have if we wanted to have implemented more sophisticated techniques. Anyway, so the big question is, why does this major disconnect continue? And so I want to just see if we can make those connections or start making those connections today. So we all know this one. People live in basements, and I'll tell you, some basements are awfully beautiful places. They are very well appointed, not like the apartment that I grew up in. My passion for basement flooding came because it was second year, and I rented an apartment, and in 2 weeks before exams, my basement flooded, and I had to move out. It was very disruptive, and I was worried I wasn't going to do well in my final exams. Engineering's brutal enough without having to worry about things like that. I later discovered this apartment always flooded in the spring. It was a different issue. It was a groundwater issue. And at least it wasn't sewage. But still, you know, my books were wet and my notes were wet. And that's because I was messy and I left things on the floor, and I should never have done that. So the expectation today is that our basements are like the rest of our house. And most people today, if they're building a new house, and certainly if they're renovating an existing home, make sure, and you know, they've watched enough Mike Holmes, they say, no, I don't want any mold or mildew. I want it to be dry, warm, I want heated floors, I want all these features. I want it to be like the rest of the house. And you go, okay, we can do that for you. We have the technology today. Of course, the valuable possession storage is amazing. You know, now what happened to people who used to squirrel all their valuables up in the rafters of their garage? That's a safe place to put your stuff, but people don't do that anymore. They have all of their valuables on display. It's like being in a museum. And of course, this climate change issue, well, we can't do anything about it now. We've sort of pushed this thing. It's like pushing somebody on a swing, and we don't know if it's going to keep getting worse or better, but we know that it's going now. And you talk to the experts, and they say, we just don't know where it's going to hit. And that's fair enough. You know, you can't predict everything. And then we know that basements experience flooding. We have all these pictures, you know, this isn't one of those things where it's like UFOs. We know that these events are real. It's compelling evidence, you know, and almost anybody you talk to, especially in the Toronto area and certainly in Calgary area, would say to you, yes, we know someone who got a basement flooding incident. It wasn't pretty. So we know they're going to go up in frequency and intensity because that's what's happening. And we know that some of them have different causes, and this issue of what we call general flooding, for lack of a better term, where we just have, it's basically overland flooding, you know, that's something that's really quite different than other forms of flooding, but it's still a form of basement flooding. But in this case, in some cases, you can also have your living room flooded. So it's not just the basement, we're talking about the whole house really getting flooded, the whole neighborhood, all of the infrastructure, all of the electrical transformer stations and so on. We're talking about real flooding, and that was really what happened in Calgary to a large extent. On the other hand, it might be just the type of water that enters through connections to the sewer, and that's different. And it may actually even enter through the building envelope. So you might have window wells, and those windows may leak water, and so the window well will accumulate water, and the water will leak in that way. So there's all these different paths, and we have to be aware of that, and they have different causalities. And the funny thing is that most cases are preventable, but not all. And I want to get back to the not all part, because there's certainly a certain level at which you have to understand that we can only do so much unless we want to change drastically the way we live. And I don't think we can afford, in our economy today, to drastically change the way we live. Not at this point. So most of the solutions have been around a long time. I've been around a long time. I hate looking at myself in the mirror most mornings and realizing just how long I've been around. And I go, my God, you know, how long has this been going on? But it's been going on a long time. And I've inherited from a whole bunch of people. So the research, there's been a continuity of research in my career. And we've looked at things like site drainage and grading and all of these practical measures for the municipal sewer surcharge types. All of this stuff has been around, and it's not that it's not being implemented. The point is, the question is to what extent. And the other thing is how is all of this tied to this whole issue of risk? And I had that as my title of my talk. It's all in the risk, because at the end of the day, managing risks and managing expectations is really the only way that you can deal with these things at a cultural level. The technology is easy. The legislation, codes, and standards are easy. Cultural responses are difficult. It's the human factors part. It's something that no one ever told me about when I was studying engineering. I thought if you solved the equation on the exam and you got an A, that you had solved the world's problems. I discovered later that no, there's these things called humans. They don't necessarily respond to these types of simple solutions. They look and they go, hang on, there's something else attached to what this place is, and it's called my home. It's where I live. And all of a sudden you go, this is different. This is not straightforward. This is not engineering 101. But anyway, so we have the technology. And you know, that's how it works. These common types we can deal with this one. This one we can just put in a backflow valve. There's all different names for these, you know. But basically that's what it is. And you put this thing in and you prevent this hydrostatic pressure from entering into your system. And you go, this is easy, I like this, right? I can deal with basement window wells. I know how to properly drain them and detail them so that they'll work. And I can grade lots and streets, and I can get it so that most of that water goes away from the buildings. Mind you, today there's another sensibility. While that water is going to be going away, we don't want it to carry with it a whole bunch of contaminants, so we're starting to think of different types of low-impact development scenarios, and that's important because we don't want to contaminate our streams. If the frequency of these events is going to increase, we don't want to be having automobile grease, salt, antifreeze, and a whole bunch of other terrible things in the environment always being flushed into our creeks. So it's a delicate procedure, but again, the solutions exist. Here's the key. Not all basement flooding is preventable. Now, these floods that we had, I don't care what you do, I don't care how you design your system, the actual topography of our geography, and we're not prepared to move, because if we're prepared to move, we can avoid this, or if we all want to live on stilts, there's a lot of things that we can get away with. We can jack our buildings up. I mean, these are the choices, but the reality is that, you know, topography has a shape. You make a shape out of plasticine, put a whole bunch of dents in it and make it look like the topography of Toronto. Take a 5-gallon pail of water, dump it on top, and you'll notice that somewhere in there, in those pockets, there's water left over. Oh, a lot of it ran off. And a lot of it just sat in those pockets. Well, what if your house is in that pocket? What if your building in your neighborhood is in that pocket? What do you do? It's a real simple equation. You have a certain amount of water coming in and a certain amount of water going out. And if the rate at which it goes out is less than the rate at which it goes in, then there's an accumulation, right? That's how you fill your bathtub. You put a plug in your bathtub. And that way you know that the water will rise because it can't get out. If you remove the plug, depending on what kind of water system you're hooked up to and how big your drain is, you may find that your water level is still rising. If you get one of those new 2-inch water mains connected to your new house off of the city service, you'll have so much water coming out of your tap that even the drain won't be able to handle it. Eventually, if you left it for half an hour, even the tub would overflow, but it has a drain and an overflow. So we try to do all of that. We try to put that in, but there are extreme events. And if you wanted to design for these extreme events, the infrastructure would be so expensive that it's the only thing we'd be able to afford as a society. So we would have no schools, no hospitals. There would be nothing that we would have except pipes so huge that you could drive transport trucks down them and have races every weekend. And that's just not going to happen, especially now. I could just imagine retrofitting the infrastructure. Look at what's happening. It was a nightmare getting here on Adelaide. It's shut off from University over. Could you imagine changing the infrastructure of Toronto? I've shown pictures of, plans from the building department of what this area looks like, all these things. And I said to them, could you just imagine, like the pain? It would be like years and years and years. And you'd say, okay, we did one block. How many left to go? Only about 94. There's 94 blocks left after this block. At 5 years, okay, 400 years from now, we'll have it rebuilt. I mean, we have to understand what we're up against. It's messy. It's hugely messy. Now, municipalities and insurers do know areas prone to basement flooding, so that's the beginning. It's very important, because if you're going to manage risk, you have to know what your risks are, and they know, but the only problem is that they don't all talk to one another, and there's no means by which they talk to one another that's been formalized. So we don't have that. You have to understand this is really critical. The other thing is that we do know there's basement flooding where it involves municipal sewer surcharge typically results in bad forms of mold growth. You get mold growth from any form of water intrusion into a basement, but when there's municipal sewage that's involved, things that people have flushed down their toilets and so on, and that stuff, and remember, a lot of this stuff is coming from places like hospitals and clinics, and it's in your sewers, and it hasn't been treated, and now it's in your basement. Nasty things happen. And if you know, those of you here that are aware of what the health impacts are of exposure to certain molds, it's serious. It can affect a person for the rest of their life, particularly if they're young. So you can just imagine a single mother with a young child living in a basement apartment and not knowing that that basement had been flooded, and not knowing that there is a type of mold in there that's not going to affect her because her immune system is okay, but her young child doesn't have the immune system to be able to cope with that. And it will result in things that affect cardiopulmonary health. So I just want to not underline, or I want to underline how important this is at a different dimension that has nothing to do with money. Well, then we get to this whole thing in our society. The willing cannot be injured. Well, you can see that this happens all the time, but of course the willing cannot be injured, and these are the outcomes. And so everybody goes, yeah, that's how life is. You take certain actions, and there are certain consequences, and you live with them. Sometimes you live with them for 20 years. Sometimes you live with them for 30 years if they can't get a job, but you live with them. And I just wanted to make sure that we understand that this may or may not necessarily apply to the business of basements. I think, and there's a genuine risk. I know I've talked to my legal friends, and they tell me, well, if people know that there's a risk and that there's actually a history and they don't disclose it and somebody ends up being harmed by it, then it's no longer volenti non fit injuria, which is an old Roman law. It's no longer the willing cannot be injured. These people are now unwilling, and they didn't know, and you never told them, but you knew. And if you know, you have to tell the person there's a risk, okay? It's a big issue. There's been some cases right now of people taking over houses that they had closed the deal before the flood, then the flood occurred, and then now what happens? And so these are before the courts, and they're interesting dynamics. And I'm not here to attempt to frighten people or anything. I'm just letting you know that it's not cut and dry. And if you're wondering why I've been using grayscale images, is because the whole thing I'm talking about is completely grayscale. Anyway, people say, well, why should people have a right to basement flooding risk and history? And I go, well, you know, look, you can find out about your car. You bang in your VIN number. I want the same thing for basement flooding. I want to type in an address, and I want to know the history. I want to know 5 times, 10 times in the last so many years. What was the insurance claim average? I want to know, because I might be renting that place. I may want to buy that income property, and I think I deserve to know that before I make the purchase, because I may then bargain differently for the price. For example, there might be mitigation measures that I can take, and they're going to cost me $20,000. I'll say to the person, I'll give you the asking price less 20. I want to put those mitigation measures in. So, is this far-fetched? I don't think so, because I'll tell you something, there's a hell of a lot more cars out there than there are houses. And the other thing is cars come and go, but houses stay. So this is it's easy. If you're a hunter, and I'm not, I used to be. If you are, everyone knows it's so much easier shooting a still target instead of a moving target. Cars are moving targets relatively in time. Houses just sit there. You should be able to collect the data and put it someplace, right? I would think so. It's 21st century. We have this thing called the internet. And the other question then came, where's the R&D? And I'm not here to plug R&D. I'm at a point in my career where, you know, I enjoy the graduate students I have, and I love supervising graduate students, but I don't know how much longer I want to keep doing this. Not because I'm tired of it, but because I'm thinking of the next generation coming up behind me. So in the same way that Paul Wiesner did his work on urban hydrology, and I was one of his students, and I ended up getting involved in this, I'm thinking I'd like to pass the baton on to the next generation. So 1.7 billion in claims due to water damage, not all due to basements, but I just used that as a rough number. So I did some basic math. This is the math part. You can tell now that I just couldn't hold back my engineering background. Every once in a while, I have to engage in some kind of mathematical exercise. This is Canada's R&D average, 1.6% of GDP, okay? Now, we're bad. Like in the rest of the world, we're looked at as like criminal, like you guys don't spend enough money on R&D. And it's true, because we're a resource-based economy. What do we care? We have most of the world's fresh water. We have our own energy. We got forests. We got space. We got everything. Can you imagine how we compare to some place like Japan? They look at us and they go, they got everything. No wonder they don't do any R&D. They're just sitting on the mother lode. It's called Canada. Everybody wants to come here. Why do you think this place is going to double in population in the next 30 years, the Greater Toronto Area and Hamilton? It's pretty straightforward. So 1.6. If you base that on 1.7 billion, and that's just the claims, that's not what people actually got as actual insurance, premiums, you'd be looking at $27.7 million annually. The insurance industry would invest $27.7 million annually in R&D, and most of it would probably be related to basement flooding, just to say. What happens if somebody said, well, we don't want to just be average, because we know we're below average. We want to be like the leading industries. We think the insurance industry in Canada should be like Apple, Microsoft, one of those types of organizations. Well, they spend about 8.3% of total revenues on R&D. That means we'd be spending about $143.7 million based on these numbers. So somebody says, well, there's probably reasons they don't, and I'm sure there are, and I've never really explored them. Because in some cases R&D doesn't pay off, or there's nothing to really R&D, or you don't have a way of getting leverage on a certain area of R&D. So, and I don't know, because I went through everything I could, and I couldn't find any publicized investments in R&D by Canada's insurance industry. I was trying to find that. I said, well, I'm a pretty good researcher. That's what I do for a living, and I got all these sources, and I got a network of contacts. And I said, what are they? Is it anywhere? Is there some place where there's a corporate report that says last year we spent $48.2 million doing research on whatever, and I couldn't find it. But it doesn't mean that they haven't. So I don't want to cast aspersions, but I couldn't find it. But then I thought, well, out of all of that money, and I don't care whether it's $27.7 million a year or $143.7, I guess the bottom question is, could we at least have an online basement flooding risk and history registry? Is that too much to ask for? Right? That's a big question today. As Dr. Evil says, throw me a frickin' bone. I'm paying all of this money in insurance premiums. Give me an online registry. I just want to know what the flooding history and risk is of the property. Is that so much to ask? I'm buying something. And obviously we know that that's not easy to do. So I just want you to also say, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, because you got to get a whole bunch of people cooperating to share information. So let's get to the risks part. So here is a risk consequences matrix. And you can see how it works. You have minor consequences and risks that can be safely ignored, and so like who cares about those? And then there's the B, the risks that can be mitigated through simple changes in behavior, and again, the minor consequences, so that's not really anything. Major consequences, low likelihood, like dying in a plane crash, very low likelihood. Major consequences, almost nobody walks away from these things. So there you go, low likelihood. What do you do about that? Well, you get insurance, right? That's what you do. What about this one? Major consequences, high likelihood, sounds like basement flooding, risks to actively identify, monitor, and mitigate. This is what you're supposed to do. I found this on an American insurance industry website. The image, I just said, yeah, I get it. So that's what we should be doing. So it's not like anyone's in disagreement. The question is how. That's really what today's about. I don't think anybody in the room says we shouldn't be doing anything. So, to wrap things up, here we go. That person was really lucky they put their backpack on the doorknob. Eh? You know what I mean? Because the old iPhone was in there, the condoms, everything. Everything that matters to a young person living in a basement apartment. I know my students so well. So digging ourselves out of basement flooding. Well, you know, it's a health and safety issue, and obviously we need better code standards and local bylaws, because it is that. We have to understand when a flood occurs, that's the biggest. So people always say, well, I don't know if basement flooding belongs in the building code. I said, what's the purpose of the building code? And they go, well, it's minimum health and safety. I go, I think basement flooding is a health and safety issue. I think we can demonstrate that it's a health and safety issue. So it should be in the code. That includes site grading and all of that. We need a lot of education. The training is extensive because people have to know how to do things. And of course, consumers have a right to know about the risks and history of basement flooding, either because you're going to rent there or you're going to buy the property. And I would argue that insurers need to know it as well, because people can switch insurance companies, and then how does insurance company A know how many payouts insurance company B made on that particular basement? Because again, if you don't know what the risk is, how do you put into place the proper levers? You need to know how things are connected and what's happening. So the guidelines should then reflect risk and the degree of prevention and mitigation measures. So we should be able to look and say, well, your insurance premium is based on your level of risk. Now I know there's a lot of people that say, well, won't there be large parts of the city where people will say, this may devalue property values? And you say, yeah, it's true. I mean, if people knew it's true, they would, right? They would. Imagine going on, you're going to take an airline. Airline A has 10 times the likelihood of their plane crashing over airline B. Do you not think that you would expect to pay less fare for the one that's got a 10-time likelihood? I mean, yes, no, I want to pay a premium. Of course not. We all know how it works. We just have to bring these marketplace realities into the issues revolving around basement flooding. And of course, R&D. We need the R&D. And we need to carry it out, because we also have this whole generation of people that have to follow people like myself and get into this and train highly qualified people that can do all of the various aspects. And it's all aspects of environmental and engineering and obviously issues of risk mitigation. There are so many disciplines involved. So it involves insurers, governments, municipalities, health organizations, design and construction professions, the real estate industry, and academia. And I honestly believe that if we could put these players together, and if we had some form of budget allocated for bringing these people together, that we could probably advance things significantly. But it doesn't mean that we will never have basement flooding, in the same way that we never have any other types of catastrophic events. They do occur, but what we would like to be able to do, I think, together is give them a reasonable degree of safety and assurance that it will only occur in the most extreme of cases, and that in most other cases that are avoidable, that the industry and all of the stakeholders have actually decided to do the right thing together. So thank you very much for having me, and I hope it's a great day for everyone.
Thank you very much. I invite any questions we have. We have about 5 minutes or so. Lots to discuss there, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, the question, you talked about creating a Carfax-like environment for basements, but there's also the issue if a municipality about giving away personal information. So we always struggle with that, right? If someone asks, did my basement flood? We, say, make a request for information on it, a FOI request, and usually we can't disclose it because it's information particular to that person. So that's going to be a battle. Do you have any comments on that, or is that evolution we have to deal with?
Well, it's really funny. It's a cultural, as I said, this is a cultural issue. If I go to certain Scandinavian countries, I can find out how much money you make and how much energy your house consumes. And people say, well, why would you want to know about that? Well, one of the reasons is part of your income is subsidized through social programs, and it's a democracy, and if I'm subsidizing you, I deserve to know. And secondly, if you're consuming energy that's causing greenhouse gases that are affecting my environment, I have a right to know how much greenhouse gases you're actually emitting. And so in those cultures, they've assumed that that's public. In North America, everything is private. At some point, we have to say, what about the cars with the VIN numbers? So, is it personal information or is it an address? I think it's an address. I don't think anybody's name has to show up there. I think it's literally an address, 418 Spruce Avenue, Peterborough, Ontario. There it is. And if it has 3 apartments in it, then it's the apartment number. I don't see where that's an issue. But again, I can see that. I can see people saying, well, I don't want people to know that. And it's like, yeah, I know, but it's a health and safety issue. So what do you do? Like do you sign a waiver? And even that would be a huge step forward if people would just put an online waiver, and then that way at least you could go to your landlord and say, before I take this place, you sign this waiver that declares that this basement has never flooded. And then I'll take the... Yes?
During the course of today, we're going to spend quite a bit of time, as your presentation did, talking about the role of the homeowner, the role of insurance companies, the role of municipal governments. Can you just share some thoughts about some of the more senior levels of governments? What's the role of provinces and territories? What's the role of the government of Canada in this overall issue?
Well, again, what we're talking about here really are fundamental infrastructure issues. And basements and housing, of course, are fundamental infrastructure in a country like Canada. We don't live someplace where you can live in a tent on a beach, which would be lovely, although it would get crowded. So here we are, we have this major infrastructure issue, and even going further, there's people that refuse to take the buyout in Alberta and said, no, I want to keep my house in the floodplain. And mind you, they were forced to sign a waiver that said no more claims. And that's true. The next time the flood occurs, they're on their own. Their insurance won't cover them. They won't get a penny from the government, but they just said, no, I'm staying. And this is what I mean by it's a cultural issue. So the legislation, yes, is the area. Those key pieces of information that allow things like the registry to be put into place. Those are the key moves. And of course, having an actual strategy, a national and provincial strategy for research and development into mitigation techniques is key. I mean, if that doesn't happen, and if you don't get that leadership from the top down, it's very difficult I know what it's like being a municipality. I have friends of mine who work for municipalities that our budgets are shrinking. It's really tough. We don't have the wealth to be able to generate our own internal R&D. We wish we could tap into some kind of a national brain trust. It's not there. So it has to become a priority for the funding agencies like the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. Those things, it has to happen here in Ontario with Ontario Centres for Excellence. We need to start this process of building the next generation of people that are going to have the expertise to work together collaboratively to get us out of the basement flooding problem, to mitigate it to as high a reasonable level as possible. We know it's never going to be completely eliminated, but I would say the frequency today is much too high given what we know.
I think we're going to have to leave it at that.
Okay.
And move on. But Dr. Kesik, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. This is